Hey, so this is a game I played recently, and yeah, so my opponent is probably the highest titled player I've ever played with. Well, actually, not ever played, ever had like an actually like decent game against, with the title of FIDE Master from Ukraine. And yeah, so let's get into it. My opponent plays e4, and I, of course, go with my tried and true, the Karo Khan. Knight f3. Ooh, I have to turn feedback off. My bad. There we go. Knight f3, d5, takes, and d4. Knight f6, knight c6. My bad. And we're getting into a simple little exchange caro. After bishop d3, there's a lot of lines. I can go for knight f6. I can go for knight f6. I can go for e6. I can go for bishop g4. And in the game, I decided to go for bishop g4, which is my favorite option, because I don't like just trapping the bishop behind the e6 pawn, but it's a completely reasonable variation. And also, I think with bishop g4 is that it puts pressure on the pawn on d4. So my opponent plays c3, and I go knight f6, bishop g5, e6 to defend my knight, make sure that if my opponent decides to capture, I can just recapture with one of my two pawns, with my queen, I mean, and I wouldn't have to double up my pawns. My opponent plays knight bd2. I go bishop e7, stopping the pin, castles, and h6, which in retrospect I think is not the best move, because, and I'll tell you this, because I think it'd be better to leave my pawns like this instead of pushing one forward, even though it makes left for my king after I eventually castle over there. I think it'd be better to do this, because after h6 and bishop back, I have ideas, like in some lines I want to bring my bishop back to g6, and I'm not really able to do that with the pawn on h6, because after it takes with the pawn, I will have a damaged structure, my f file will be open, which can be useful, but I have this backwards pawn on e6, and I don't like that. So in retrospect, I probably shouldn't have played h6, but it's not the end of the world, and I go g6 afterwards, mostly because I thought, okay, well, I'm not going to put my bishop back on h5 now. If my opponent attacks me like this, I want to put my bishop on f5 and take back with the g pawn, so then my file can get open and I have decent pressure. And that was probably a better way to play, and I thought that was pretty smart. My opponent goes castles, and I go queen, not castles. Opponent goes rook e1, and I go queen d7, keeping more eyes on the f5 square. My opponent goes queen c2, and I actually make a blunder here. My problem with bishop f5, which I thought was smart, because queen c2, there's no pin anymore, and I thought my bishop isn't doing anything right, so why not move it back to f5 prematurely? In retrospect, probably maybe long castles would be better, or short castles, but it's kind of hard to make a move for white, because without bishop f5, and the reason why bishop f5 is bad is because takes, because my king is still in the center, and the pawn is pinned and uncapturable. That was my big issue, and of course I should not have played like that, but my opponent misses it and plays the move knight e5, which actually kind of gives me back hope, because now after takes, there's a pawn here, and now there's no more pin on my king, and there's no more tactic with the bishop, so I am happy. And I thought, okay, well, now the best thing to do, I don't like this bishop here. If I could trade off this bishop for my bishop, I think I'd be doing pretty well, doing pretty solidly. Then I could bring my rook here, and then I might be able to even castle on some lines, and then I think I'm probably doing better. So I play knight h7 with the very simple idea to trade off the bishop, and my opponent goes bishop g3, which I thought was a bad move, because the reason why I thought this was a bad move, obviously, is because he's just kind of looking into his pawn. He's not really very active there, and I didn't think that would be useful at all. I don't think that's a useful square for my opponent, because either my opponent's going to go here and get into like a weird bad diagonal here, or he's just going to sit there indefinitely, never being able to escape, because I'm not going to play like f6 and get rid of his blockade. So I play h5, which is a decent move. It controls the g4 square, and I might be able to go bishop h6 in some lines. My opponent plays h3, which is reasonable. He wants to get his bishop out, and I go h4, continuing with my plan of pushing the pawn further and making some problems on the king side for him. And he goes bishop h2, which is reasonable. It makes sense. It makes sense to go bishop h2. And so I go knight f8. Knight f8 is another interesting move. The reason why knight f8 instead of, say, anything else, well, knight f8 is like, it's in the way. My knight is in the way on h7. I'm not going to develop out here because my knight has no prospects out, and these squares are always covered. So if my knight could be on g8, that would be better, but with the knight on f8, it's at least makes some progress, and I might be able to take and play g5 and develop my knight to g6 in the future, and also my knight can go to d7 in some lines. So I thought this was probably the best way to play. I still think it is. My opponent goes knight f3, developing his knight. I don't think this is very smart, though. For master, he's keeping the advantage, but still, this doesn't seem like a very smart move, because I don't think the knight has many prospects. If the knight goes to d4, well, I can just play a6, and there's nothing left for it. Well, of course, I would take first and then play a6. And it's kind of interesting to me, because that knight kind of it just sucks. It just sucks. I would rather, like, if I was him, if I wanted to develop the knight, I might play knight f1, for example. I thought this might be decent, or maybe even knight b3, but this doesn't seem as good. It is actually better, but whatever. So knight f3, and takes, and g5, which makes sense. Obviously, going with my plan of going knight g6, and it keeps ideas of g4 alive and some type of king side attack. So, of course, my opponent brings a rook to the center, and I have this great idea. I have a great idea. And the idea is super cool. I really like this idea. The idea is queen a4. And I played an idea similar like this in an over-the-board game that I shared on this channel, actually, that you may have seen. And the idea is simply to cover this entire line with my queen. And my queen is actually kind of active here because I'm also attacking a pawn. But my opponent plays a great move. My opponent plays just amazing move here. My opponent plays this move. Oh, well, actually, no. My bad. I gave my opponent too much credit. No, he didn't play an amazing move here. No, he just played a simple a3, and I go g4. Makes a lot of sense. Going with my plan of why I put the queen there in the first place, my opponent goes knight d4, which is... This is the good move. This is the good move that I'm worried about, because at the end of the day, after, for example, gh, my opponent will get a queen trade, and if my opponent gets this queen trade off the board, I thought that I was in some trouble, because my opponent's threatening knight c7. I probably have to go king d7, and then he has like some c4. I don't really like that. Maybe I'd even have to sacrifice a pawn. Maybe I'd have to go like rook c8 or something at that point. Or maybe even bishop d8. Ugh, rough. But yeah, I didn't really want that to happen. So after a gh, my opponent actually took gh. I do wonder what would happen if my opponent went here. But at the end of the day, after all of this, I'm up a pawn. And I can go... I actually don't know. I'm going to put some lines on. Yeah, king d7. Might have c4. Yeah, I thought c4 here, and then rook g8. Rook g8, and I start an attack, even though I might be losing some material in the short term. I'm starting an attack, and I might have, and I have some advantage. Okay, I can be down with that, but that's hard to go into. Those are some hard lines to go into, and I just was kind of afraid of the queen trade. So my opponent played gh, and I played a6, with the simple idea of stopping the queen trade and making sure that my position was half decent and that he didn't have any infiltration spots. And he goes to king h1. Of course, the idea being to put a rook on the g file and start pounding me on all sides of the board. So I developed my bishop with bishop c5. Putting some pressure on the knight. I'm not really threatening to take it, but it's more or less just a developing move. My bishop is probably better than the knight in most endgames, but I just wanted to develop my bishop and keep everything solid. And another reason I wanted to do this is because I couldn't play knight g6 immediately, because of course that loses to the move knight e6, and I didn't want to lose a pawn, obviously, so I didn't. I'm gonna go bishop c5. Oh, also knight 96 works in any line, but either way, rook c1, and I take the knight, which is an interesting line, as you can hear by my computer in the background trying to make sense of it all. Not really trying to make sense, but it's more like dying, I guess. The reason being is, of course, so I can play the move knight g6, but also there is an issue with this line, is that after cd, which is the best move and what he plays in the game, it gets a little rough. I don't know why I have move feedback on, and I don't actually in the analysis, but it's still on and it's still driving me crazy. So the reason why this is bad, obviously, is because the rook gets active, and that'd be rough. But I continue my plan. I'm not giving up yet. I go knight g6, and although I do have a bad position, it's not the end of the world. My opponent goes rook c7, and I decide to go for something a little different. I decide to go for queen a5, and the reason why is, obviously, this is a fork. This is a fork, very simply, of both rooks. But of course, he doesn't have to follow that. He can defend. He can defend both of them at the same time with, of course, just rook ec1, putting more pressure and threatening maybe rook c8 in the future. And I don't want to get down with that, so I don't. But first, I defend my pawn with b5, and this loses, obviously, as you can see by the eval bar. And my opponent plays the best way. My opponent keeps the advantage and plays the best top engine move, queen f3, attacking my pawn in f7 and threatening a checkmate. Of course, I have to defend that, but it's kind of dangerous, because I'm playing a FIDE master, and I'm already, the psychology of all of it is pretty scary, because I think, okay, I'm gonna lose, or maybe I'm gonna win, because I noticed his rating, of course, 2010. It's a little bit lower than mine. And normally when I see a titled person at this level, I'm a little bit less scared of them than I would be at another level, because obviously if they've gone low enough to this level, then that probably means that they have they're probably pretty old and have lost a lot of rating points before. So I'm not too scared, but it's still pretty scary to see that title. And I decided to defend the best way with the castles. Defending my pawn on f7 and keeping everything together. And here my opponent goes crazy. Here my opponent gives me a second lease on life, which is so nice, because I would be completely losing. Like, for example, if my opponent found the best move, which is bishop f4, I just lose. Like, the top engine move here is queen takes c7. I mean, no one's ever gonna play that, but I'm lost. My opponent's just simply threatening bishop h6, and I'm not able to move my my rook, because then I get checkmated. So, well, also he's threatening maybe queen f6 after bishop h6. But anyway, my opponent actually plays a terrible move. My opponent plays rook g1, which is pretty funny. As you can see, this move is a blunder. Yeah, this loses. Of course, the queen takes c7, which I play in like 1 second, because obviously, if my opponent's attack works, then I just lose. But I have to at least try with queen c7, and here I actually play like all the best moves in the position, which is pretty funny. My opponent goes for queen h5, which is a decent move. He's attacking my pawn on h4, and I go king g7. Of course, with the idea of bringing my rook out to h8, keeping everything together. Takes, and I again played the best move, and I'm very proud of this move. I realized that if I put my rook on h8, my opponent's going to get into f6, and it's not actually the end of the story, because there might be some perpetual check. So I realized it's not about developing my rook, it's about stopping the f6 plan, and the only move to do that is queen d8, which I'm pretty proud of, because it's pretty fun to put the queen back on the home square to defend the king, which is really nice. Queen there, and rook h8 comes, of course, simply developing my rook. Rook g3, and I play queen h4, offering a queen trade. If he trades queens, of course, I win the game. Simple as that. And I actually thought that I made a mistake here after queen f3. I thought I made a mistake because it's kind of hard to make a move here with black, because whenever I move the queen, he gets into f6, and I really didn't want to allow that. So I was kind of nervous, but then I realized that queen f3 actually allows the queen trade after queen e4, and I simply am able to win the game. The rest of the game is very simple. King takes, and then I just bring my rooks, and he hangs a bishop, and I win the game. So, yeah, that was this game. Let's go through it again. So out of the opening, I got into a much worse position here, with a lot of pressure on me, and with my king in the center, not really a good place to go. It was kind of rough. I made a blunder and lost a pawn, but my opponent didn't see it and allowed me to live. I tried to do some things, and he put his bishop on a bad square. I pushed some pawns a lot. I pushed pawns further, but my rook and knight, these two, were kind of out of play. So I brought them into play. Well, I brought my knight into play at least with the move queen a4, which started g4 and attacked the pawn. I thought this was very smart. All that happened. My opponent takes back, and I stopped any queen trade from happening. King h1, I'm able to trade off the knight and develop my knight. He gets his rook into the 7th rank, and I make another blunder after b5, which actually loses to queen f3 and a devastating attack by my opponent. My opponent instinctively loses a rook, which is something that could happen in a normal game, but it's kind of cheap. And then I kind of play the best moves, and of course I trade queens, and my opponent resigns after losing a bishop in a completely lost position. So that was this game. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you guys found it instructive. Maybe not, because I mean, it was kind of cheap how I won the game, but hopefully you guys found it instructive. Yeah, good evening and good night.